Hello, this is Sami from Intelligent Systems with a short tutorial on how to install, set up and work with the Advanced Manufacturing Disassembly app. You can install the app directly from the app source from Microsoft or by contacting one of our sales representatives who will guide you through the process. After installing the app, which can take a few minutes, you will eventually end up with an environment where you can go to the already installed extensions and start a wizard which can guide you through the rest of the setup process. Now I'll leave this one to finish, and at the end of the installation process you will be greeted with the following screen. So the end of the installation process will automatically start the disassembly setup wizard, which in case for some reason doesn't start for you, you can also invoke from extension management by finding the line which corresponds to the Advanced Manufacturing Disassembly app and clicking on setup. It will take you to exactly the same place. So going through the setup process is essentially a wizard which can allow you to go through all the necessary setups. One of the things it will do for you is, actually there is one step that was kind of skipped. So you need to go through the setup here. I guess I already set this up. Okay, so there is a setup. Oh, fuck. So this wizard will initially take you through a step which I don't have to do right now, which involves registering for a trial license. It's a fully automated process. You just click and it will initiate it for you. So at the end of this, you have a choice here to make. Do you want to get a template that has some predefined settings and data, or do you just gonna get the template with no data? So I'll choose the first option in this case to make it simple if you are not sure how to do the testing. The second option is in order to allow you to test with your own data. When you click next, you're taken to this page where clicking download template will download the file for you. First time you may need to provide access, and the file looks something like this. It's a standard configuration package file which has all the various tables that we need to set up. You will have a new location created. A few geo accounts may need to be created in order for us to provision them in some of the setups. Some items with their corresponding setups, templates, units of measure, and so on. You can take a look at it. It's pretty standard. The only really custom thing that you'll probably not be familiar with are the disassembly BOM components and the disassembly setup, but I'll guide you through them in a second through the system itself. So after you download the template, then you can click next and provide the file, at which point you go through the usual configuration template import process. You can click import here, it will import the file. Takes just a few seconds, and at the end of this you will have the option to have the system process the file for you. Usually it goes without a glitch, but if there's any errors you can review them. It's more or less a standard import, so in this case there's a few errors, nothing dramatic. So at the end of this process you're greeted with the disassembly setup screen where right now we have pre-populated with the recommended minimum settings. You can of course modify these, and I will take this chance to explain how the setup works. So basically you have an option to decide where do you get dimensions from. When you're posting documents, you can get the dimensions from the item or resource card, or you can take them from the order header. And this refers to the fact that for the components of the disassembly order, which we'll see in a few minutes, you have various items. And of course in the header you also have an item as well. It's kind of like a reverse assembly order. So the question is, do you want the components to inherit the dimensions from the item which you're disassembling, or do you want the dimensions to be set at the component line level? Then you can assign a default location which is used for orders. That will assume that that is the place where you are doing the disassembly process. And you see later there's some level of flexibility where you can actually have this location be the location from which you're consuming the raw material that you're disassembling, and then you can have different locations to which you will be outputting the final disassembled components. We use a special general business posting group to allow for different posting setups. There's a different source code applied to entries. There is a evaluation allow posting from date, so this will mirror kind of the functionality of the inventory posting periods. The idea being that when we are allocating the cost of the components calculated based on disassembling the main item, there are cases where this revaluation can happen based on a job queue, or you may be applying some changes to the cost. So essentially, if those changes are supposed to happen before this date, then the system will use this date as the posting for the entries. And any transactions happening after that will use the normal posting dates. The auto post revaluation function will essentially mean that at the end of finishing a product disassembly order, the system will automatically calculate and post the cost to the components which were disassembled. If you disable this, then you need to schedule a job queue to perform this action periodically. Then there is a revaluation journal, template, and batch, which can be used in some specific cases, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But the short version is you are able, after the fact, to change the cost of a component in case for some reason the market cannot absorb the cost you ended up with. So you can reallocate a portion of the cost from one of the components to the rest of the components which were produced by disassembling the main item. And there's a function which will use these journals for that. Exact cost reversing mandatory works exactly the same as in purchasing and sales. In this case, in disassembly orders, if this is activated, then you will be forced to specifically select the entry for which from which you want to consume components, rather than the system choosing this automatically for you. And we have a scenario which will not be covered in this specific tutorial, but essentially you are able to handle processes where at the end of the disassembly, so you grab a main component, you break it down into its subcomponents, and then you may want to package those, for example, or do some post-processing. So we kind of allow you to do an assembly order within the disassembly order you're doing. To be fair, it's not the recommended method, so that's kind of a niche case. So by default, I would suggest to disable this one. And then, of course, you have some number series as expected. So at the end, you also have some posting setups, which are with some predefined, pre-populated accounts. You can, of course, at this stage, change the accounts to match ones that correspond to your chart of accounts. So these will be lookups to the geo account list and so on and so forth. And that's it. At the end, you are ready with the absolutely set up and finished module. Now, we use a different database because I did a few more settings. But what I'm showing you is still mostly based on the same demo that you have imported. So what do you end up with? Well, let's start with some master data. So first, in order to work with the master data, actually, you may want to set up your profile to one of the two custom profiles you have, one for the disassembly order processor and one more generic disassembly profile. Both of them are similar in that you have some shortcuts, as you might assume, to the disassembly module, and you have some queues provided here. Nothing too fancy at this stage. So let's go through the master data first. So we will go to the items list first, and you have a new field called disassembly BOM here, which you can use to sort to find the items which are set up to be disassembly items. And there's a few fields which are added to the item card. All of the rest is standard. One of the fields is something called a disassembly price, which is something you may want to set up for your components. So on the item that is a disassembly BOM, that is the main thing that you will be disassembling, which in this case is a whole Black Angus beef, let's say carcass, for example. This field will not be mandatory, but for all of the components, you may want to assign a disassembly price. So you can think of this as a base allocation coefficient, which can be used to define the cost of the components. Typically, this will mean it's a portion of the cost of the main item that you have predefined to be assigned to this item. The final actual cost, of course, will define on how efficient the disassembly process was, so this is not necessarily the cost that will be taken. Having said this, if you use standard cost, then this field doesn't matter, and whatever is the standard cost will be taken as the de facto disassembly allocation coefficient. So we'll come back to this a little bit later, but this is something that's mandatory to set up for all of the components. Then if you scroll down to the replenishment tab, you have, I have to mention there is at this stage no integration with the standard replenishment model, so there is no disassembly option as a replenishment system. That is something that is in the pipeline and will be provided at a later stage. You do have, however, a separate option here to see the disassembly BOM, and which we'll go to in a second, and a new field which is called disassembly wastage. So this is only set up at the level of the main item that you will be disassembling. Think of this as a warning percentage. The idea is that if you set up a value here, then the system will check when you're posting the order. If the actual waste that you have generated is higher than this percentage, then you'll get a warning message. So it's kind of a threshold to make sure that you didn't forget to output a certain component, or that maybe somebody was extremely inefficient and you want to double check things. So let's get to the disassembly BOM. You can access it from here, or of course you can go to the bill of materials. I believe we have added here the disassembly BOM as well. It doesn't really matter which option you choose. There is no other way to get the disassembly BOMs at this stage, so those are important. So what do you set up here? It's probably familiar. It mostly looks like a assembly BOM. There are a few notable differences. One of them is that we have this field called the disassembly type, and by default it's going to be production, and that is the recommended value. The idea is that everything that you set up here that is of type item and disassembly type production are the components that will be derived from the main item you're disassembling. You do have the option, however, to add either items or resources as consumption type. And if you choose a resource, then by default the type is consumption. You don't have a choice to change it. But if you choose an item, then you can decide whether this item is going to be a consumption or production type. So the reason for these extra lines of type consumption are essentially additional costs that you want to add to the production process. So typically these would represent either resources, which you can use to represent the labor cost, or additional raw materials that you need to add in the disassembly process. So I don't know, some chemicals that you need, or utensils, or stuff like that. So anything with a type consumption will be consumed, despite it being in the lines of the order, and its cost plus the cost of any resources will be added to the pool of total cost, which can then be allocated to the output components. Speaking of that, we have the evaluate checkbox, which essentially allows you to choose. So we have the cost of the main thing we're disassembling plus any cost of consumption type lines. So those are combined and then will be allocated to form the cost of the output components. But you can choose if all of the output components will be assigned cost, or some of them will just be registered as inventory and not grab any of the cost of the main item. So for example, I might say, well, the tail is something I want to register because it's something I want to see how many tails I have, but I don't actually do anything productive with it. So this item on this line will not get any of the cost of the main Black Angus carcass that I'm disassembling, for example. And you can do this with any of these items, which means that, for example, if I have a whole beef that costs, I don't know, $1,000, and then you're assigning it between these items, then these $1,000 will be allocated between all of those lines except the oxtail. and we will add the cost of the cutting to the cost of the beef, so it will be $1,000 plus whatever is this cost here, and that's how much will be allocated between these items. Which is where the component quantity comes into play. So you can of course directly assign quantity per, but essentially if we found out that for a lot of our customers it's easier to define that as an average. When we disassemble a whole half black Angus beef, 12% of it will be neck and claw, 4.5% will be chuck, steak, and blades, and so on and so forth. So rather than thinking in quantity per, thinking in percentages. So me increasing this percentage will essentially recalculate the quantity. And it is expected that this total percentage is not more than 100. Although I don't know, if you can perform magic, you can of course make it more than 100. You can, however, make all of these lines be less than 100%. So this means you are assuming a default percentage of wastage. So any lines that are not defined with a quantity here, you can actually register quantity on them, and the total quantity here can be less than the sum of the item that you're disassembling. Of course, you have the unit of measure in which you want to be measuring these quantities, so that's pretty normal. And then you have a location code. So this is where if you leave this empty, then the system will assume the location code from which you're consuming the main component you're disassembling is the same place where you will be outputting the components. However, you can choose to have a different location for each of them, which means that you can select it here, and then in the disassembly order this will be taken. So this is the main setups you do on the disassembly item. The next thing you may want to do is go and create a disassembly order. Now, before we do that, there is an extra functionality we created, which is called a disassembly forecast. And it's intended to allow you to create some kind of a what-if analysis, where you can say, okay, if I want to disassemble this half black Angus beef, for example, and I have 100 kilograms to disassemble, or 100 in whatever is the base unit of measure, and this is my base cost per kilogram, then I can use this to calculate, based on the output quantity percentage, what is my forecasted cost for unit cost, and then respectively cost amount for each of these lines. And so in this case I get the unit cost from the item card is this much, but the forecasted unit cost is something like that, which is based on the total quantity that we have. And this is where you can play with these numbers. There is an option where you can actually change this, and you can say, well, what happens if my cost here is 5, for example, or 19, and as you can see, it immediately turns red because that is a cost that is different from the forecasted one that I have in the item card. And you have an option here to decide to update this cost back into the item card, and then this will be my new forecasting cost, if that is what I want to do. So yeah, essentially what if analysis, where I can see, okay, how would the cost play, and what will my wastage, for example, look like based on the numbers that we've assigned here. So based on my current BOM quantities, I'm forecasting a 5% wastage by default, which is already higher than I put as a mark on my item card. You can create as many of these forecasts as you want. Something to note is that if you decide to update the cost from here into the item card, this will not reflect in any other disassembly forecasts, but their costs will turn red to signify that now they have a different cost than what's in the item card. And of course, you can have the system calculate, which right now there is nothing to change, but it can calculate the output quantity based on the BOM, essentially. So in the end, you can also use this function to create a disassembly order based on the forecast directly from here. Or of course you can just go and say, I want to create a new order, and then select the item that you want to disassemble. At which stage you have to enter the quantity that you want to disassemble. So let's say 100 kilograms. And you have by default the location code that we defined, and you can see it's the same location from which all the components will be output. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, if you chose a different location code in the item card, in the BOM, this will be overwritten. So what you're normally expected to do, and there's a lot of fields here, so I won't go through all of them. There is a separate manual which explains. Of course, the important ones are the posting date, which is when you're doing the postings, and you have a status which allows you to track whether the order is still open as right now, or you release it, in which case it's as usual locked for editing. And in the end, you will change the status to finish, which means you are done, and this is kind of like a finished production order. Initially, right now you see 100% wastage, and that is because we have not populated anything in the quantity to handle. So in the lines you have all the lines which you have from the BOM, and you have quantity per and output quantity. The quantity to handle is where you define, so how much are you actually able to produce. So my estimated based on the BOM is, let's say, 12 kilograms neck and cloth, but I could be extra efficient and get 13 kilograms. So this will mean that in the final cost allocation, eventually I will have a better efficiency. So the cost will be based on this quantity rather than on that one. And you basically are supposed to, you can use the function to say, okay, calculate the quantity based on what I have by default. That's in case you change something. But the assumption is that the user will come over here and update these quantities one by one. Now, so let's say we have 13 here, we have 5, maybe we're less efficient here, 12.6. Let's actually create a bit of waste. So we'll do this 6.8, 2.2, 3.3, and so on. Of course, you're not, as usual, the idea is to reflect on what happened in real life. So if you did not get a certain component, then you just do not output it. And 4.6, and I do believe I have a little bit more here. 3, 2.7, and we'll have all of the resource. You can, of course, add manually extra lines, type item and resource, and you can decide that these are either additional raw materials that you used, so add it to the pool of cost that can be allocated, or maybe you have an extra component that you produced for some reason. So all of these are perfectly normal. In the last step that you have to do here is, of course, most of the time, especially if you're dealing with meat, like in my case, I may need to work with item tracking. So you have an item tracking lines function in the header, where I get to choose which lot number am I disassembling in this specific case. And then, of course, for each line, you have, again, the option to assign some item tracking lines, again, lot expiration dates, whatever you set up. We do envision that in most cases, especially when you're dealing with meat, it's assumed that the lot of the component is going to inherit from the main item that you're disassembling, which is why we have this function for auto tracking, which will assign for all of the lines the same lot number that you have in the header, and in this case, the same expiration date. There is, of course, an option to leave the expiration date empty. And that is something that we're working on in the next release. Now, in this case, actually, the expiration date is auto-populated because I already had a transaction with the same lot number. So normally, when you choose to use the auto tracking, then the system currently will only copy the lot number from the header and leave the expiration date empty. And that is because very often the expiration date can be different, especially if you're freezing the meat or there's a special other process. Another reason is the fact that very often we expect that in the lines of the components, you can actually set up an expiration date calculation formula, which is standard Microsoft field. So this would mean then that the system is calculating the expiration date for you. And then that assumes that you have to leave the field empty. We are, however, working on a next release where we actually dynamically check. So if you did not set up a expiration date formula, then the expiration date will also be copied from the header item tracking. And if you do have a formula, then we'll obviously ignore it. So I have all of my quantities set up on how much did I manage to output in the quantity to handle. I have the quantity that I'm consuming, and of course you can do partial, so you can do a partial consumption in the header, and of course you can do partial output in the lines. All of these are perfectly normal. Essentially you can think of this as a reverse assembly order. The end step here in this case is to post. And when you post, you have the option to separate, and this is where we enhanced the standard assembly orders. You can separately do consumption only, and additionally after that do only the output, in this case production. So you can choose to split the two processes depending on who is doing the reporting and when you have the information available. In the end, or of course you can do both at the same time. So after you post the quantity to handle, then it will be transferred as handled finished quantity, so there isn't much you can do here. I forgot to mention you can use bins here, so you can do some level of warehouse management with this. We have enabled the ability to create a warehouse pick or an inventory movement document, so there is integration with WMS, but that will be a separate video we'll do at some point in the future. So when you're done, when you finish posting everything, then what you do is you change the status and you mark the order as finished. This will be the step during which the system will automatically calculate the cost for the and reallocate the cost of the items. So if we were to check the transactions, so I'll go to the item ledger entries right now. You see that what we're posting are positive and negative adjustments, but we have a new document type which is called a posted disassembly. So that's how you can easily filter. So we have a negative adjustment for the beef with our respective cost, and at this stage we're using the costs which are from the item card. So note, for example, that the highest one right now is the 65, which is for this item, which is the Nex and Clod. When you finish the order, what the system is going to do is first give you a warning message, in this case saying that the actual waste is higher than the 3% on the item card. So making sure, are you sure, didn't you forget to post something? And what this essentially means is that if you sum up the quantity that was handled, that is less than the 100 kilograms that we consumed, and the difference in percentage is 4.7% in this case, which could be perfectly normal. When I click yes, the order will be transferred to finished, and then I can find it in the archive as finished disassembly orders. Now, what the system does is, because I activated a special function that I mentioned earlier to auto-evaluate, it automatically triggered the function that I would otherwise normally have to trigger manually by clicking here, output revaluation. And what it does is, if I go here, I think I can find entries will be the option here. If we go to the item ledger entries, we can see that the cost of this item, actually all items, but the one that used to be 60 something, which was the highest cost, is actually no longer the highest cost. And what the system did was it posted an additional revaluation transaction in order to allocate the cost of this item. So now the sum of these items should be 716 as a total. And the way we do this is by posting a bunch of value entries, essentially. So there is a very nice report we call cost in decay, which you can run at the end. And this will allow you to see exactly how the cost was calculated. and it will calculate, okay, maybe keep it like this. It will calculate the percentage allocation between the components. And we have also added an extra line here with the wastage. We assume that the wastage has 0 cost, so there is no cost assigned here, but this is the new amount based on the, and this is calculated purely based on the quantity that was output. So as I said, you have the costs in the item card, which are kind of like a basic initial estimation, and you have the quantity in the BOM, which will give you a default output quantity, but the actual cost in the end will always be allocated based on the actual output compared to the actual consumption that was posted. And you can actually run a version of this report by removing the filter. You can run it for a certain period of time, location. You can add some total production lines, so you can see the total for each production order, how much was consumed, and then you have the total components which were output for this period of time. So if I remove this, then what essentially I'm looking at is that I have for this production order these components, this production order these components, and how the cost allocation was done. So yeah, this is a very brief overview of how this works. Now there are a couple of additional special functions I want to mention. One of them is, I did mention in the inventory disassembly setup that you have a special evaluation option. So the way it works is, for example, you might have a scenario where this rump steak, for example, is costed a little bit too high for the market to absorb. And what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to reevaluate this item specifically. And it will create, okay, I do need to assign some extra permissions. Essentially, I think I may need to assign myself as a super user. Anyway, the way it works is it will generate an inventory journal for you, inventory evaluation journal, where you can change the cost of this item. So it will be identical to me, item or evaluation journal, to me going here and selecting this item and saying, okay, I want to revalue that specific entry from that specific order. And I believe that is my order. And you can change the cost here. So what's different for me using the function from the order as opposed to running it from here is that once I change the cost here, at the end, I can run the output revaluation, and what the system is going to do, it's going to reassign the difference between the cost that I had so far and the new cost that I assigned to this rump steak and redistribute it through all the other items on the order. So this is something that will happen automatically when you're running this function. And it's, again, intended to allow you to absorb in a more market-friendly manner the cost of the product and reassign it to items that can allow a higher cost. Something else that could happen is you could encounter a situation where after finishing an order, you may realize that maybe a user made a mistake or there's something you may need to post additionally, like additional consumption or additional output. So we added this restore function, which can only be triggered by users with a special permission. So right now I do have this permission, which is assigned in the user setup with this new checkbox we've added called allow restore disassembly orders. And what essentially this does is, as you can see, I no longer see my order in the finished orders. And if I go to the order processing disassembly orders, I can see my order as open, and I can technically post anything additionally that's necessary. And again, this is only allowed for specific users in certain cases. There are some special additional pages we've created. For example, there is one which allows you a good overview of what you've posted over some period of time. So it is called Disassembly Orders Revalue Entry. So, and actually I believe you can find it from here. this one. So this is where for each order you can see the main type, a breakdown of the costs that were posted on this order. And if you click on any of these, you see a breakdown of the capacity ledger entries, which we use to generate these values. So we have the value quantity. If you scroll down, eventually you get the cost amount actual and the cost posted to GL. So this is per order, and then you have the consumption. So in this case, this will be only the negative adjustment, which is again capacity ledger entries. So we're kind of mimicking how the manufacturing module works. And the capacity ledger entries are because I had a resource. So this is the cutting, which is registered as an item ledger entry, but really it's not really an item ledger entry. So I believe this covers most of the functionality. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to iSystems sales team. We do have a help desk which can provide assistance at any given time.